I'm Pastor Epaminondas. I've been here for 72 years, and since I was very young, I have fought spiritual battles against forces that few believe are real. I have seen it all, eyes that have become black holes, voices that could not come out of human mouths, bodies dominated by something other than flesh and bone. But even with all this experience, there are cases that have remained engraved in my mind as if I had crossed eyes with evil itself. One such case happened about 10 years ago at a university in the heart of the interior of the United States, in a small town that I do not want to name, but that haunts me to this day. It was a call in the early hours of the morning, like so many I receive. My phone rang at 3 in the morning, the time when silence weighs heavily and darkness seems closer. On the other end of the line, the voice belonged to an old friend, Professor Andrew Clayton, who taught theology at that university. He was a serious man, even a skeptic, someone who had always preferred to keep his faith in the books and in divine laws rather than get involved with the supernatural. But that night, his voice was shaking. I had never heard Andrew speak like that, a mixture of fear and urgency. He had spoken about me to some of his students, young people who, according to him, had opened doors that should not have been opened. Andrew knew what I did, but he had never approved of my practices. As an exorcist, I am called to deal with the worst side of existence. And as much as many despise it, my work is dirty and dark, but necessary. He told me that a group of students in a fraternity far from campus had played a game with a Ouija board. I thought it was strange because I knew that place had a dark past. Stories of sacrifices, voices in the night, unexplained disappearances. On every college campus there is a fraternity like this with legends that frighten new students. But there was something different here, something that the most sensitive felt on their skin when they crossed its gates. I didn't wait for daybreak. I grabbed my Bible, a vial of holy water, and my old silver crucifix, which has never abandoned me on the darkest nights, and drove along the deserted roads. The night seemed denser than usual, and the moon, hidden by heavy clouds, left the road shrouded in shadows. The university was hidden on a high point in the city, a group of old buildings with Gothic towers and narrow windows that hide secrets. The air there was already heavy before I even entered. Andrew was waiting for me at the door of the fraternity. The man I met was a shadow of the strict professor I knew. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembling. Without delay, he led me to the hall where the young men waited. When I walked in, I immediately felt the weight of something very wrong. I saw 4 of them, pale-faced, sitting in the corner of the room, wide-eyed, like frightened children. Something in their faces told me that they were far from the arrogant, skeptical young men who toyed with forces beyond their comprehension. They were marked. Pastor Sam, the leader of the group, said in a voice that sounded more like a lament than a greeting. We didn't know it would be so real. Sam had a Ouija board in his hands. It wasn't the kind you'd buy at any toy store, but an old one, carved from dark wood, with symbols engraved on it that I knew were not decorations. I felt a chill as I looked at it. But more than that, I felt a presence, something invisible. But it was there, watching, waiting. The others, Josh, Emily, and Rachel, were silent, seemingly incapable of uttering a word. Their eyes, however, spoke volumes. There was despair there, an agony that only those who have seen the abyss can bear. I approached Rachel, the youngest of the group, and saw that her hands were scratched, as if she had tried to free herself from something that was gripping her with invisible claws. When I touched her shoulder, she recoiled, looking at me with a look of pure terror. I heard him, Rachel whispered, barely audible. He said your name. Azazel. He said he wanted our souls. Azazel. That name brought back a dark memory. I had faced entities before, But Azazel was one of the oldest and most evil presences I had ever heard of, an entity that dated back centuries of darkness and destruction. It wasn't the kind of force you invoke with impunity, much less something that is released without consequences. I tried to talk to the group to understand the details of what had been done. I discovered that after invoking the name, Rachel was the first to be touched by the spirit. She felt as if something had possessed her, forcing her to say things she didn't understand, to see things that weren't there. Sam also heard voices the next night, and since then, all four of them have been having visions and nightmares, waking up with unexplained marks on their bodies. "You brought this here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but with a weight that only someone with years of experience in such cases can carry. "It's not just a joke, it's a mark, an opening to something that now belongs here." And then I saw something that gave me chills. In the center of the room, where the board had been placed, a dark stain formed on the floor, like a circle that burned from the inside out. The mark pulsed, as if it were alive. It wasn't just a sign, it was a connection, a portal that somehow connected our reality to hell. I knew this was just the beginning. What had happened that night was far from a coincidence or a simple, misguided experiment. Those young people had released something that demanded a high price, and I, Pastor Epaminondas, knew that to close those doors, I would have to face evil itself. If you asked me, I would say that evil never enters uninvited. It waits, lurking, patient, until someone is foolish enough to open a door, and that is exactly what these young men did. Innocently, perhaps, but no less fatally. Before I arrived, they had extended their invitation with one of those old Ouija boards, the typical artifact that in the right hands can become a weapon, but in the wrong hands, a ticket to hell. As Sam and the others told me, the night began like any other. It was October, the month of mists and longest shadows, and the fraternity was full of ancient legends that encouraged dark games like this. Sam had bought the board at an antique shop a few miles away. He said that the board seemed to call to him, that something drew him to it. A common description of haunted objects. There's always a force calling to someone, especially someone young and vulnerable, full of curiosity. It seemed like a perfect prank for Halloween, Pastor, he explained, his voice full of regret. We just wanted to have fun, scare each other. We didn't know it was going to happen. They waited until the night was at its deepest, when the rest of the house was silent and the lights were out. In the middle of the fraternity living room, they lit some candles, placing the Ouija board in the center, surrounded by shadows that danced as the flame wavered. Sam took the initiative, and the others followed, perhaps reluctantly at first, but unable to resist the mix of adrenaline and fear. Sitting around the board, the four of them extended their fingers, barely touching the pointer. Sam playfully began asking questions. What did you want to know? Who had lived in the house before them? Were the rumors of hauntings true? For a moment they thought the game was just that, a pointless game, and they laughed at their own superstitions. But as I said, evil awaits. Just as everyone was ready to get up and call it a night, the hand moved, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but everyone noticed. The laughter died away. The silence fell like a weight on them, and their eyes fixed on the small piece of wood that moved of its own accord. "Who's there?" whispered Rachel, the youngest, barely able to hide the tremor in her voice. The hand slid to the letter A, and then, as if guided by some invisible force, continued to spell out Zazel. Azazel, whispered Emily, startled, as if the name had a dark resonance that she instinctively recognized. Everyone looked at each other, their breaths caught in their throats. The room seemed to have grown colder, the air becoming dense, charged with something they didn't understand, but felt. With each new question, the pointer moved faster. As if gaining strength, they began to ask bolder questions. What do you want from us? Why are you here? That's when the pointer stopped, and then moved again, forming a single word that no one would dare say out loud: souls. At that moment, Rachel began to tremble, and before anyone could react, her eyes rolled back, revealing only the whites. She began to murmur, as if speaking to someone the others couldn't see. "I hear, I see you," she said in a hoarse voice that wasn't her own. "He's here, he wants all of us." The other three called her name, but she didn't respond. It was as if she were trapped somewhere far away, lost in a direct connection with that spirit. The voice that came out of her was deep and disturbing, echoing as if another person were speaking from within her. The presence in the room intensified, something invisible that squeezed the others' chests like a cold hand on their souls. Josh, the most skeptical among them, tried to break the circle, standing up, but the door to the room slammed shut, locking itself. The wind whistled in the windows, and the candles began to flicker, their flames turning blue, tinged with an unearthly energy. Emily looked desperately at Sam, tears in her eyes, but he seemed paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. Suddenly, Rachel writhed on the floor, her face twisted in an expression of pain and fear. In a guttural voice, a mix of her timbre with something much older, she spoke, "You called me. Now I am here." It was not just any answer. It was a declaration of possession, a warning that there was no turning back. In that moment, Sam and the others understood, with visceral horror, that they were dealing not with an ordinary spirit, but with an entity of pure evil, something ancient, famous, and relentless. When the candles finally went out and the room was plunged into absolute darkness, all they could hear was Rachel's soft laughter, or whatever possessed her. Her laughter reverberated in the darkness, echoing off the walls in a supernatural way, multiplying into whispers that came from all sides, as if the environment itself was mocking them. That night, the young people left, but their spirits were already marked. They slept, but were tormented by nightmares of indescribable visions. They woke up with scratch marks on their bodies, bruises that they didn't know where they came from. That evil energy hovered over them like a shadow, following them at every step. They couldn't close the door they opened, and it was then that they understood that they would need help, the kind of help that I, Pastor Epaminondas, could offer. They had no idea how much that mistake would cost. When I arrived at the fraternity, the scene I found was desolate. The walls seemed to breathe, as if something was moving behind them. With each step, I felt the pressure of that dark presence, the kind of energy that someone with a lot of experience in exorcism could sense. Evil was permeated in every corner of that place, like an invisible spiderweb, ready to capture anyone who dared to get too close. The four young people were gathered in one of the rooms. Sam led me to the place, trying to maintain the posture of someone who still believed in control of the situation, but his eyes betrayed him. He was terrified. When I entered, I saw Josh and Emily sitting on the floor, their heads down, as if they were carrying an invisible weight. And Rachel, well, Rachel was different. Unlike the others, Rachel was standing, still in a dark corner of the room, and seemed to ignore our presence. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she were staring into a dimension beyond our own. With each passing second, she muttered something under her breath, an ancient, indecipherable language. A chill ran down my spine. I had seen this kind of behavior before. This young woman was being possessed by something dark, something that refused to leave her. "Pastor Epaminondas," Sam said quietly as he closed the door behind me. "She hasn't been the same since that night. It's like something is inside her." I knew what it did. Rachel wasn't just haunted. She was in the grip of an evil presence. What had started as a reckless prank had become a full-blown possession. And this presence, Azazel, was more than just an angry spirit. It was an ancient, powerful entity that thirsted for human suffering. "She talks to him," Emily whispered. looking at Rachel with teary eyes. Sometimes we hear her whispering to herself, but it doesn't sound like her voice. I moved closer to Rachel, trying to catch the words she was murmuring, but her language was a jumble of disconnected sounds and unpronounceable words. It was a forgotten language, a communication between her and that dark force. When I finally touched her shoulder, she stopped murmuring and slowly turned to me. When our eyes met, I realized I was face to face with something beyond human comprehension. Rachel was staring at me, but it wasn't her. It was the entity behind those eyes, and that entity knew me, as if it knew who I was and what I did. Its lips curved into a wicked smile, one that didn't suit Rachel's young, innocent face. "Epaminondas," murmured the voice, hoarse and heavy, that seemed to come from a bottomless abyss. "I thought you would take longer to come. I was looking forward to our meeting." That voice, although low, made the walls of the room seem to tremble, as if the entire house reacted to its presence. I looked directly into its eyes, and with the calm that only years of spiritual battles gave me, I began to murmur a prayer, trying to drive away that presence. But Azazel laughed. The entity laughed inside Rachel's body, a cold and wicked sound that made Sam and the others recoil. "Do you think words will save you, Pastor?" the entity mocked. "These young people called me, and now I am here. You do not have the power to send me away." I knew Azazel was playing with me, trying to destabilize me. But one thing I have learned over the years, evil feeds on fear, and I couldn't allow him to feel he had any advantage over me. "You may have been called," I said, my voice firm, "but it was against their will. And now I will do whatever it takes to get you out of here." Azazel snarled, Rachel's eyes going so black there was no trace of color left in them. She writhed, her body bending at impossible angles, as if she were being twisted from the inside out. Suddenly, she lunged at me with inhuman strength, trying to throw me off. But I held my ground and held the crucifix before her, speaking words of power. With each prayer, the spirit within her seemed to waver, but it would not give up. Rachel struggled, trying to free herself. As I pressed on, never giving an inch, I felt sweat beading on my forehead, the weight of the fight against that relentless spirit. He promised me things," Rachel whispered, in a voice that mingled her own with the demon's. "He promised he could give me power, protect me. But all he brought was pain." I realized that, for a brief moment, Rachel was there. She had managed to manifest herself, perhaps only for an instant, but there was still part of her. I looked into her eyes and said, "Rachel, he has no power over you. We'll get you out of this." She shook her head, tears streaming from her eyes, but the spirit quickly regained control, and the dark expression returned to her face. She knew she couldn't exorcise Azazel all at once. He was strong, clinging to her body like a parasite that refused to let go of its victim. Finally, with a last scream, Rachel fell to the floor, unconscious, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The others gathered around her, checking her pulse, relieved that she was still alive. But we all knew it wasn't over. That evil presence was still there, just waiting, hidden. I turned to the others. "You have unleashed a force you do not understand," I said, looking at each of them seriously. "Azazel is ancient, an entity that exists only to corrupt and destroy. You played with fire, and now it won't let you go so easily." Josh finally broke the silence, his voice shaking. "What can we do to stop this? How can we get rid of it?" I took a deep breath. I knew the battle would be long and difficult, and that it would possibly scar these young people forever. "But the first thing you need to understand," I said, "is that you have to completely renounce this presence. You invited it in, but now you have to reverse that connection. That means you have to repent with all sincerity. Only then can we take the next step." The night wore on, and the candles burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I instructed them to help each other, and together we began to pray. Each word we spoke was a way of strengthening our souls and preparing ourselves for what was to come. The evil was still there, despite our determination, but I knew that this battle was only just beginning. Azazel would not be exorcised easily. He had taken root in these young people's lives, and I would have to descend into the depths to free them completely. And as they prayed, each with their eyes closed, I felt a presence lurking all around us, a shadow larger and denser than any other. The spirit was there, listening to every word, waiting for the moment to strike. I knew that, as dawn broke, we had just won a small battle. The war against Azazel had only just begun. The following days were dark, shrouded in a fog of uncertainty and fear for those 4 young people. After the first exorcism attempt, they knew they were no longer alone on that campus. Azazel accompanied them like a shadowy presence that dragged along, stalking every step they took, and Rachel, she was no longer the same. Her eyes seemed sunken, and even her gestures had become strange, almost mechanized, as if someone was manipulating her body from a distance. That morning, I was called back to campus. Professor Andrew Clayton insisted that I come there immediately. When I arrived, I found the 4 of them waiting for me in the professor's office, each of them with a lost look, as if their sleep had been stolen for nights on end. Andrew was beside them, trying unsuccessfully to show some comfort or reassurance. As soon as I entered, Sam immediately declared himself and came to me. It was clear that the fear was beyond what I could bear. "Pastor Epaminondas," he said, his voice breaking, "please, we need your help. This thing, it won't leave us. It's like it's inside our heads." I walked over and one by one looked into the eyes of the young people. I saw a deep despair in their faces, a kind of desolation that I knew only a deeper evil could cause. They had been touched by hell, and their souls had been stained by contact with Azazel. "I want you to tell me everything," I said, trying to better understand what had been happening since our last meeting. "Everything you saw, heard, felt." Rachel spoke first. Her voice was low, hesitant, and she seemed to choose her words as if she feared that each one might conjure up something terrible. "Since that night, he's been on my mind," she said, looking down at the floor. "I see visions, flashes of things that aren't real. Sometimes it's like I'm outside my body, looking down on everything. I hear whispering voices calling my name. He's promised me things, promises that I know aren't true, but they're so convincing." She paused, taking a deep breath, and then revealed something that made everyone in the room cringe. "And I feel like a part of me wants to give in, like there's something inside me that agrees with him." That last confession put me on alert. Azazel wasn't just haunting Rachel. He was trying to take root inside her, seducing her with promises and fragments of power. And from what I knew of this entity, he wouldn't give up until he'd completely extracted her essence, until he'd trapped her in a vessel of his evil. "That's his goal," I said, looking at Rachel and the others seriously. "Azazel wants to take you, Rachel. He wants to corrupt your spirit until you accept him into your heart. That's the real danger of a spirit like that. He doesn't just possess you, he poisons you, and he'll try to do the same to each and every one of you." Emily, who had kept her eyes fixed on her hands until then, interrupted me. "Pastor, we're living a nightmare every night. We have nightmares about him. We feel him watching us. Did you hear that? It sounds crazy, but we feel it. A weight, like we're being suffocated in our own bedrooms." Every word she said reinforced what I already knew. Azazel wouldn't stop until he had complete possession of these young people. I needed to do something more intense, a ritual that went beyond a simple prayer of exorcism. "Listen to me carefully," I began. "I can try to drive him away, but he has already placed a powerful bond with you. This type of entity cannot be driven away with words alone. We need genuine repentance, a true renunciation of everything you summoned that night. That is the first step. Azazel needs to know that he is no longer welcome, and that needs to come from you. The four of them nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Possession was an invisible but devastating threat, and I knew that the closer we got to the final exorcism, the more Azazel would resist, using every trick and illusion to cling to the young men. I instructed them to spend the rest of the day in prayer and repentance. They needed time to prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for what was to come. In the meantime, I retreated to Andrew's office and asked for privacy. I needed to do something I had not done in a long time. Prepare myself spiritually for battle. I spent hours fasting and praying, coming out with strength to face Azazel. I knew that this fight would not be like the others. He was one of the oldest and most powerful demons, and to face him, I needed to strip myself of any trace of fear or doubt. Later that evening, I met with the young men again in the main hall of the fraternity. I asked them to turn off all the lights and light only a few candles positioned around a circle I had drawn on the floor with salt. Salt was a barrier, one of the few earthly protections against evil entities, and I knew it would be crucial to keep Azazel confined while we tried to drive him out. Once everyone was inside the circle, I instructed them to hold hands and keep their eyes closed. The energy in the room seemed to vibrate, as if the house itself was aware of what we were about to do. I knew Azazel was aware as well. I could feel his presence, a thick shadow that was getting closer and closer. I began to pray in Latin, needing the strength necessary to weaken the demon. The candle flames flickered, threatening to go out, but I kept my voice steady, emphasizing each word as if they were being thrown against the darkness. The young men began to mutter prayers as well, their voices mingling with mine. I could feel the fear in each of them, but there was a growing determination there. Azazel's presence seemed to recede, but it didn't disappear. It was as if he were gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Suddenly, Rachel began to shake violently, her head falling back as her eyes rolled back. She let out a scream that echoed through the room, a sound of pure suffering and despair. The others tried to release her, but I shouted for us not to break the circle. "He's here," she said, her voice broken and unrecognizable. "You won't get rid of me that easily." And then, like thunder, Azazel's voice echoed through Rachel, a deep, distorted voice that rang out throughout the room. "I have been called, and I will not go away." I stared into those eyes that were no longer Rachel's, but an entity that had centuries of evil in them. I continued to pray, holding the crucifix in front of her and commanding it to leave. Rachel's body contorted, her limbs bent at impossible angles, but my determination did not waver. "Azazel, by Christ, I command you to release this soul," I declared with all my strength, feeling each word penetrate the air. "You are not welcome here, and this house is not your domain." The demon laughed, but I felt his power begin to weaken, even if only slightly. I knew he would not give in easily, but I also knew that we had taken an important step. The battle was just beginning, but there was a spark of hope. As the hours passed, I continued to pray, without pause. I knew this was a war of resistance, and I couldn't give up. Not while Rachel's and the others' souls were still at stake. At dawn, I felt Azazel's presence retreat, like a shadow that hides with the arrival of light. Rachel collapsed to the ground, exhausted and disoriented, but alive. The others were pale, but the gratitude in their eyes was evident. They knew they were not alone in this fight, and that I would fight to the end to rescue the nightmares. But even with the light of day bringing some peace, I knew the war was far from over. Azazel had been repelled, but he was still there, lurking, and he would return. Despite the temporary respite, we knew that Azazel was still haunting us. That dense, evil presence continued to hover over us like a dark cloud, threatening to fall at any moment. Rachel had been silent since the last confrontation. Her eyes, once lively and curious, were now just glazed over as if they had lost their shine. I could feel that he was still inside her, hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. After a few hours of rest, I began to prepare what would be the first complete exorcism. I knew that Azazel was an ancient demon and would not give in easily. To face him, I would need something stronger than simple prayers. I needed a strategy, a combination of faith, sincerity, and a profound ritual, prepared with care and intention. Before starting, we gathered the young people and explained the gravity of what we were about to face. They first understood that the battle would be arduous, both physically and spiritually and psychologically. I knew that, to expel an entity of this caliber, the process would be intense, full of moments that could test even the strongest of spirits. "You must be ready," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "This is not a quick process, and Azazel will use all of your weaknesses against us. But if you keep the faith and follow my instructions, we will be able to win." The four nodded silently, their expressions showing a mixture of fear and determination. They knew that there was no other way out. If they wanted their lives back, they would have to fight for them. Already in the main hall of the fraternity, where we drew a large circle of protection on the floor, using consecrated salt and holy water, I asked everyone to gather around Rachel, who was positioned in the center of the circle, sitting in a chair. Rachel looked listless, her body frail, but there was something strange about her posture. It was as if she knew what was about to happen, or, more accurately, as if something inside her knew it. I began the exorcism with the sign of the cross, holding my crucifix in my right hand as I sprinkled holy water around her. Rachel reacted immediately, her body writhing as if the water burned her skin. She began to mutter, whispering in a strange language that I recognized as an ancient demonic tongue. "Epaminondas," she whispered, her voice distorted, a grotesque mix of Rachel's own voice and something deeper, darker. "Do you think you will banish me so easily?" The others recoiled, visibly terrified, but I stood my ground, looking her straight in the eye. "You do not belong in this world, Azazel," I declared in a strong voice. "By the power of the Most High, I command you to leave this body and free this young woman." The entity laughed through Rachel, a quick, icy sound that echoed through the room. Her eyes, which had been glassy before, were now completely black, like pools of darkness. "You are a fool, Pastor. She belongs to me now. You all belong to me." Hearing this, I intensified my prayers, reciting passages of sacred scripture with the greatest faith I could muster, feeling a dense energy building around me. Rachel began to scream, an agonizing sound that made the walls seem to tremble. She pulled at the chains that bound her to the chair, her body arching at impossible angles, while the entity inside her resisted fiercely. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and the air became thick, almost unbreathable. The smell of sulfur began to fill the air, a putrid odor that seemed to emanate straight from hell. Sam, Emily, and Josh were pale, praying quietly, but their eyes were fixed on Rachel's contorted body, paralyzed by fear and horror. Rachel spoke again. "You have no idea what you are up against," Azazel said, mocking us. "But I have existed for eons, long before any of you, and I will continue to exist when you are all dead." Even with those words, I continued, not allowing him to undermine my resolve. I knew this was a game of manipulation, a trick to weaken our faith. "Azazel, you have no power over us. By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this body now." The entity laughed once more, but I could see that behind that facade of confidence lay a weakness. The prayers and the ritual had had an effect. However small, Rachel let out a roar, her body convulsing violently. Her eyes rolled back, and her skin began to form marks, dark lines that clearly showed designs, demonic symbols engraved on her skin like a hellish tattoo. It was then that Rachel, or rather Azazel, played his last card. "Do you know what she wanted?" the demonic voice said, its tone sneering. "She wanted power. She wanted revenge. She was the one who called me. She gave me permission to enter." I glanced at Rachel, but remained focused on the ritual, refusing to be distracted by the provocation. I knew it was just another attempt at manipulation, a strategy to plant doubt and weaken our resolve. "You are lying, demon," I said firmly. She never sought this. "And even if she did, I removed this ring in the name of the light. Leave now." I increased the use of the holy water, sprinkling it directly on Rachel as I recited a final prayer. The marks on her skin began to fade, and the pained expression on her face intensified. Azazel was giving in, albeit slowly. I knew it was a partial victory, but at least a step forward. After a few grueling minutes, Azazel's presence seemed to begin to dissipate. Rachel slumped back in her chair, her body relaxing as the others watched her, relieved but exhausted. She was semi-conscious, but alive, and for a brief moment, the hall was completely silent. The other four gathered around, relieved. They seemed to have gained new hope, a sense that perhaps they could win this fight. But I knew better. This victory was temporary. Azazel had been weakened, yes, but not defeated. He had retreated into the darkness, but I could sense that he was still there, lurking, waiting for his moment to return. And each of us in that hall knew that the battle was far from over. As the young people hugged each other and sighed in relief, I gathered them together and said, "You must not let your guard down. This fight is not over yet, and Azazel is a cunning enemy. He will be waiting for your next moment of weakness, so continue to watch and pray. We have much more to face before this entity is completely driven out." We left the hall, but we knew that Azazel was still nearby. Each of us bore an invisible mark, a reminder that evil does not give in easily. It fights, waits, and returns. And we would have to be ready to face it again, with every step that gave signs of its presence among us. That partial victory gave me some relief, but I knew it was just that, temporary. Azazel hadn't given up. He was just hiding, waiting, like a beast that retreats before the next attack. To face such an ancient spirit, I needed to understand where his connection to that place came from. I knew that the fraternity hid dark secrets, and that there was more to the story than the young people imagined. The next day, I went to the university's registrar's office. It was an old, dusty building that seemed rarely visited, except perhaps by a few researchers and history students. I knew that this kind of investigation could provide me with important clues. I was interested in discovering if there was a pattern or specific event that had drawn Azazel to that campus, and I suspected that the fraternity had been an epicenter of dark activity long before Rachel and her friends arrived. The librarian, an elderly gentleman named Walter, greeted me with a small smile and a nod. He had seemed reserved, but upon hearing my explanation and realizing the gravity of what I was investigating, he decided to cooperate. "Pastor Epaminondas, you've come to the right place. This fraternity, Omega House, has a very disturbing history," he said, pulling a large, dusty book from a high shelf. "It's rarely talked about, but many years ago, there were some disturbing events. With Walter's help, I began to leaf through the logbook. In the yellowed pages, I found references to various incidents, mostly occurring in the 1940s and 1950s. There were stories of disappearances, students complaining of voices in the night, strange, shadowy figures seen wandering the halls of the fraternity. However, one particular entry caught my attention. In 1952, one particular case occurred. a series of clandestine rituals performed by a group of students from Omega House, fascinated by the occult. These young men, seduced by the mystery and the promise of power, obtained the opportunity to perform ceremonies in the dead of night, experimenting with ancient invocations that brought protection and wisdom. Thus, they unwittingly opened a door. According to reports, these rituals culminated in a tragic event. One of the students, a young man named Thomas Merrick, was found dead in one of the basements of the fraternity. The records indicated that he was found in an unusual position, surrounded by symbols drawn in his own blood. Officially, his death was ruled a suicide, but many believed that Thomas had attempted to summon a powerful presence and that the ritual had gotten out of hand. "This is the point of origin," I muttered, more to myself than to Walter. "This is where it all began." I continued reading and found something even more disturbing. After Thomas's death, many students who participated in the rituals were plagued by nightmares and hallucinations, some claiming to hear Thomas's voice calling them to the other side. It was assumed that they had tried to seal Azazel's spirit away, but to no avail, leaving a scar on the very spot. These young people, Rachel and her friends, they have only rekindled what was never extinguished, I thought, feeling the gravity of the situation weigh upon me. I knew that Azazel was deeply rooted in this place, and that any attempt to expel him would require more than a simple exorcism. Walter, noticing my expression, seemed hesitant to say more, but something was bothering him. After a few minutes of silence, he revealed another piece of information that made me even more apprehensive. "There is a legend, Pastor," Walter said in a low tone. "Some say that Thomas Merrick himself made a pact with Azazel, offering his soul in exchange for power, but that the pact extended to anyone who tried to summon him there. It is believed that anyone who tries to establish contact with Azazel in that building is marked forever." This information gave me chills. Rachel and her friends had not only summoned Azazel, they had reactivated an ancient pact, an alliance between the evil spirit and those who dared to call upon him. I returned to the fraternity that afternoon, seeking to share what I had discovered with the young people. Sam, Emily, Josh, and Rachel were gathered in the main room, visibly tired and worn. Rachel, in particular, was haggard, her eyes sunken and her face pale. The possession still seemed to be latent, as if Azazel was waiting for the right moment to return. I knew this confrontation would have to be meticulously planned. Azazel was more deeply embedded in House Omega than any of us could have imagined. Discovering the history of the original pact and the macabre rituals performed by Thomas Merrick was enlightening, but also alarming. It involved more than simply banishing an entity. We needed to sever the bond that bound Azazel to the place and, more importantly, to the young people who had awakened him. As I explained to the four of them what I had discovered, I could see the fear growing in their eyes. They were frightened, but there was a collective determination, an understanding that this was a fight for their very survival. Rachel, especially, was shaken. I knew the demon had marked her as its prime target, and her vacant, empty gaze betrayed the weight of the torment she was going through. With each passing moment, Azazel was taking a deeper root in her. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice reverberating around the room. "Azazel has been summoned here for decades, and his presence has never been completely expelled. This means he is not just possessing Rachel, he is trying to reaffirm the pact, using you as intermediaries." The silence was thick. We could feel the tension building in the air. We decided that the next step would be a full-fledged ritual of protection and purification, something that would require spiritual strength and commitment from everyone. We needed to seal every entrance, every corner of the house, before beginning the final exorcism. I asked them to help me prepare the house for the ritual, while I instructed them on what we should do. We began in the dark hallways and the main entrances. I sprinkled consecrated salt on all the doors and windows, saying a prayer of protection and invoking the forces of good to strengthen the spiritual barriers. I asked the young people to remain focused and to pray with me. Each one held a crucifix and a candle. The light was crucial to dispel any shadows that would not move around us. Next, I asked them to help prepare the main hall, where we would perform the final exorcism. I placed 4 large candles in each corner of the room, forming a square that would represent the barrier between our world and Azazel's realm. In the center, I drew a protective circle with salt and holy water, with ancient symbols meant to keep an entity contained. The young people helped me, though reluctantly and visibly shaken. I could sense that each of them was in a state of extreme tension, but there was also a spark of hope and courage. Sam, I said, seeing her trying to contain her fear, it's important that all of you stand your ground, no matter what you see or hear. Azazel will try to intimidate us. He will use everything against us, but he feeds on fear. If you can resist, we have a chance. He nodded, trying to give the others strength. Rachel, for her part, looked increasingly distraught. Her face was pale, and I knew Azazel was affecting her more by the minute. His presence, silent and oppressive, seemed to loom over us like an invisible shadow. Once we finished preparing the hall, we gathered for one last instruction. When we begin, no matter what happens, we will remain within the circle. Azazel will try to break our formation to escape, but we must resist together. I looked at each of them in turn, trying to convey the reassurance they needed. Emily, Josh, Sam, you are all part of this ritual. Your presence is essential to strengthening the barrier against him. I then looked at Rachel, who was visibly more dejected. And, Rachel, I know he is stronger in you, but you must fight. Only you can prevent him from taking over your body completely. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I knew this battle would be more intense for her than for anyone else. With the hall prepared and the young people positioned, I began the opening prayer. With each word, the air seemed heavier, as if something was gathering around us. The room was cold, and the candle flames flickered as if they would go out at any moment. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, a fragile protection against the approaching darkness. As I began to recite the exorcism in Latin, I felt an immediate resistance. Rachel began to breathe heavily, and her eyes took on a dark, almost black color. She trembled, as if something was trying to escape from within her. In the midst of the prayers, an entity began to manifest its presence through her. You are so pathetic. Azazel's demonic voice came from Rachel's mouth, but it sounded completely different from her own. It was deep, husky, an echo coming from an endless abyss. I was here before all of you, and I will be here when you are dead. The words were followed by a ghoulish laugh that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the room. Emily began to cry, but she stood firm, holding the crucifix tightly. Sam and Josh were frightened, but I could see that they would remain firm. I continued the prayer, ignoring Azazel's provocations. He tried to shake our faith, but I knew we could not give in. With each verse, you could feel his presence wavering, even if only slightly. He was strong, yes, but our prayers and our unity were having an effect. Azazel, I command you to leave this place, I shouted, with the crucifix pointed directly at Rachel. By the power of Christ, release this soul and leave this place. Rachel writhed, letting out a terrifying scream. Her arms and legs bent at impossible angles, and her mouth spread into a smile that didn't belong to her. But I didn't give up. I repeated the prayers, intensifying the ritual, focusing on each word. For a moment, Rachel seemed to come to. Her eyes briefly took on a pleading look, as if she were asking for help. Please, help me, she whispered, her voice weak and broken. But before anyone could react, Azazel took control again. She is mine, he said, mocking us. She called to me, "You cannot undo what has been done." But we didn't give up. I continued the exorcism, this time with even more truth. I knew we were close to weakening it. The candles flickered and the circle of protection seemed to glow brighter. Each of us felt the weight of that moment, the direct struggle between good and evil. Suddenly, Rachel let out a final scream and her body collapsed to the floor, inert. The hall plunged into absolute silence. For a few seconds, no one moved, fearing what would come next. Then slowly, Rachel opened her eyes. They were clear, no longer the black coloration of before. She looked at us, confused and frightened, but she was there, really there. Azazel had been repelled, at least for now. The others rushed to embrace her, relieved and excited. But as they celebrated, I knew that this victory was not the end. Azazel was still bound by the pact of that place. He had been weakened, yes, but he was still there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. The victory seemed real for a few moments, but the uneasiness inside me did not dissipate. I knew that Azazel was too cunning to give up so easily. The dense energy that surrounded the Omega house had not disappeared, and Azazel's shadow still loomed over us. That evil presence seemed to be waiting, weakened, yes, but not defeated. Rachel, now leaning on Emily's shoulder, was still shaking, and her breathing was irregular. When she looked at me, her eyes held a mixture of collapse and fear. I knew she was there, but I also knew that her soul was still marked by that entity. It was then that, while my young people talked among themselves, a chill ran down my spine. The air around us seemed to darken, and the candles around us began to flicker frantically. I received no more signs. Azazel was gathering strength, and he would not leave us alone without one last battle. "He's still here," I muttered as I looked around, noticing the shadows lengthening on the walls. "This is the last warning we'll ever get." The young men looked at me, terror returning to their faces, but I couldn't let them be consumed by fear. We needed to be united and focused, or we would be defeated. "Everyone to the circle," I ordered, raising the crucifix and reinforcing the barrier with prayers. The final confrontation will be here and now, and we must be prepared. As soon as everyone was in position, a macabre laugh echoed through the hall, coming from all sides, as if the very structure of the place had been taken over by the evil presence. Azazel's laughter echoed through the walls, a mixture of contempt and hatred. The candles went out all at once, plunging us into a darkness that seemed solid, oppressive. Then Rachel began to writhe, her body arching as if pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes opened, but this time they weren't black. They were red, burning with a dark light. "You think you can cast me out?" The demonic voice sneered, coming from Rachel's mouth but not her own. "This house has been mine for decades, and no feeble prayer can change that." Azazel's fury was palpable. The ground beneath our feet shook, and the walls rippled, as if the house itself were alive and lined with darkness. The young men's fear was evident, but I knew it was time to face Azazel with all the strength I had. I gripped the crucifix and began to chant a powerful prayer, a prayer I had learned many years ago and used only in situations of great danger. My words simply echoed in the hall, each verse a blow against the darkness that surrounded us. The young men joined me, their voices trembling but firm. Rachel struggled more and more, letting out screams of pain and fury. Azazel was forced to give in, but not without a fight. His threats filled the hall, promises of revenge and eternal destruction for us all. "You have no idea what you are facing," he roared, as Rachel's body contorted into impossible angles. "Your souls will be mine, and once I am finished with you, this place will be mine again." I continued the prayers, intensifying the strength of each word, each phrase. I used all the power I had, every shred of faith and determination. Azazel was a powerful demon, but I knew that he was also proud, and that pride had always been the downfall of fallen angels. Suddenly, a dense shadow began to emanate from Rachel's body, forming an indistinct figure, dark as night and as cold as ice. It was Azazel manifesting himself outside of her, his form revealing itself as a grotesque silhouette, with flaming eyes that stared at us with pure hatred. "Do you think you have power over me?" The figure sighed, your voice now mixing with the icy wind that enveloped us. "I am ancient, much older than any of you can comprehend. This place belongs to me, as do those who dared to summon me." I knew it would help strengthen the barrier, and I asked the young men to repeat a chant of banishment with me. Their voices joined mine, and the energy in the room began to change. We felt Azazel waver, his shadow shuddering as the chant echoed off the walls. "I command you, in the name of Christ, to liberate this place," I shouted, feeling the power of the words growing around me. Azazel's shadow writhed, and Rachel fell to the ground, exhausted but visibly relieved. The entity struggled, but its form began to fade, as if it were being pulled away by force. Each word, each prayer acted like a blow, forcing it to release its connection to this place. In a final act of desperation, Azazel let out a deafening scream, a last attempt to intimidate and break our hold. The entire room seemed to vibrate, as if reality were about to crumble. But we kept up the chant, all of us, without giving in to fear or exhaustion. Finally, with a final, agonizing scream, Azazel's shadow was ripped from the space around us, being sucked away into the depths from whence it came. The room was filled with an intense, almost blinding light, and then silence. The candles lit again, and the air became light, as if a storm had passed. Azazel's evil presence was finally banished, and Omega House seemed to have returned to its original state. Rachel, now free, wept silently, her friends hugging her in a gesture of relief and solidarity. We were all exhausted, but we knew we had won. Azazel's connection to that place had been severed, and the ancient pact that kept her there was broken. I knelt beside Rachel, placing my hand on her shoulder. "You are strong, Rachel," I said, trying to comfort her. "Evil feeds on weakness, but you resisted. It will no longer have control over you." She looked at me, tears still in her eyes, and murmured a grateful, "Thank you." I knew it would take time for her and the others to overcome the trauma of what had happened, but now they were free. Azazel would no longer haunt them. I left Omega House at dawn, certain that the battle was finally over. But as I left, I couldn't help but cast one last glance at the building, as if I could still feel a faint shadow watching us. Maybe it was just an impression, or maybe evil never completely disappears. But at least in that moment, I knew that we had managed to escape Azazel, and that House Omega would have a chance to heal from the burden it had carried for decades. And so, with the sense of duty accomplished and the weight of the battle still on my shoulders, I set out, knowing that this would be a confrontation I would never forget. I left Omega House that morning with the feeling of a battle won. The morning light dispelled the shadows that had evidently haunted us throughout the night, and the icy cold of the confrontation with Azazel finally gave way to a mild, comforting warmth. However, we knew that nothing would be easy to forget. Each of us, especially the 4 young men who had faced the abyss itself, would carry invisible scars, memories that could never be completely erased. The young men walked silently beside me as we left the campus. They were exhausted and shaken, but free, finally free of the dark weight that had plagued them for so long. Rachel, in particular, seemed to support our friends with every step, as if every inch of her body was marked by the brutal experience she had endured. She still wore an expression of disbelief, a lost look that betrayed what many survivors of possession experience, a feeling of emptiness, as if a part of her had been ripped away. As we reached the end of the campus, Sam let go of me. His face was pale, but his eyes expressed a mixture of collapse and curiosity. Pastor Epaminondas, he began hesitantly. We won, didn't we? Azazel is gone. For good. I knew he wanted reassurance, confirmation that the horror would not return. I looked at him seriously, trying to find the right words. Yes, I replied, trying to be as clear as possible. Azazel has been cast out, and his bond with this place has been severed. But never forget, young people, that evil always finds a way to stalk those who toy with it. You have opened a door that cannot be fully closed. His presence is gone, but the memories, those will remain. Sam nodded slowly, as if trying to process what I had just said. He and the others had learned a lesson that few children their age did. The spirit world is real, and dabbling in the unknown can have devastating consequences. Rachel walked over to me, still shaking, and looked me in the eyes. I don't know if I can ever thank you enough, she said, her voice cracking with a deep vulnerability. I didn't know. I didn't know it was real. The pain in her words was palpable, and I knew it would be a long road before she found peace with herself. I touched her shoulder comfortingly and said, "You are strong, Rachel. Now that you know what happened, use this experience to strengthen your spirit. The struggle with evil can be terrible, but it can also teach us to value the light. Never forget that." The others gathered around, and they realized that despite the suffering they had shared, there was something that united them now. They were no longer the same people who had summoned a demon out of curiosity. They had faced the darkness and emerged with a new understanding of themselves and what it meant to respect the unknown. Before I left, I decided to seek out Professor Andrew Clayton to tell him about the outcome. I found him in his office, where he was waiting anxiously. Upon seeing me, he asked immediately, "So, is it over?" he asked in an uneasy voice. "It is," I confirmed, nodding. "Azazel has been expelled, and his bond with House Omega has been severed, but those young men will never be the same, Andrew. They have crossed a line that many never dreamed of crossing." The professor nodded slowly, absorbing what I had said. "These young men are like sons to me," he said, his voice breaking. "And while I would never want them to face something like this, perhaps it will teach them to be more wary of the unknown." We said our goodbyes, and he thanked me repeatedly, promising that he would do his best to monitor the fraternity and ensure that Azazel's story would not be repeated. He knew that the secret of what had happened there would remain between us, but he also understood the importance of keeping the place free from further evil influences. As I left campus, I drove back to my parish. The deserted roads and the quiet of the morning were the perfect setting to reflect on all that had happened. The experience with Azazel reinforced something I had always known. Evil is a patient force, waiting for moments of vulnerability and reckless curiosity to manifest itself. And with every victory, evil will always try to return. When I got home, I sat down and said a prayer of thanksgiving, asking for peace and protection for these young men who would now face a new kind of challenge, that of rebuilding their lives. I asked each of them to find peace, to use this experience as a reminder to honor light and hope. A few days later, I received a letter from Rachel. In the letter, she describes the gratitude she felt and the profound impact the experience had on her life. She had decided to study theology, determined to better understand the spiritual world and never again be led astray by the unknown. The other young people also began to share their responsibility with me, sharing how the experience had changed their perspectives, teaching them to value faith and goodness more. Although I knew the scars would never completely disappear, I also knew that I had gained something valuable. They had gone through that experience with an inner strength that only those who face the abyss can develop. And I, Epaminondas, was also marked by that encounter. The battle against Azazel reminded me that as long as there are people ready to face darkness with courage and faith, Evil will never have the last word. I hope you enjoyed the story, my beloveds. Like it, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Tomorrow I will be back to tell you a new story of the many that I have already experienced.